So this is my take on a recipe for Appelflappen, which is literal translation is apple flaps or slices, and it's a light batter that surrounds them and deep fried. So 2 tablespoons of sugar, 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, a quarter teaspoon of salt, 2 large eggs, a third of a cup of buttermilk, a third of a cup of milk. If you don't have buttermilk, just use 2/3 of a cup of milk, and 3 1/4 cups of flour. And you are making a batter, not a dough, so that's why it's not a lot of flour and a fair amount of baking powder. So the type of apple you want to choose, Granny Smith, Honeycrisp, or Royal Gala, was the choices I had, and I used a Granny Smith and Royal Gala. You have to pick one that does well with heat and doesn't fall apart with high heat. So, a pie apple or an apple that does well for cooking. So. You also have to keep in mind the size of the apple and your fryer. So if you have a small fryer like I do, I don't really want a large apple because the slices are going to be large, and then they'll crowd themselves and not have a lot of room for frying. So these are kind of medium-sized apples, and they worked out well. So like I said, I ended up slicing 5 apples, but by the time you get good slices and everything, it ended up being 4. So it's up to you whether you use 4 or 5, but for this amount of batter, it's about the end result is about 4 apples of medium to large size. Okay. You want no less than 1/4 of an inch. Some people do 1/2 inch and have larger, thicker Appelflappen, but found 1/4 inch is a happy medium kind of thing. So, and you can see that I cut sometimes the bottom flat, so it's easier to cut. So that's a tip. While you're slicing, if you find it rocking around on you, just cut a little bit off the bottom so it lays flat on your cutting board or cutting surface. And if you don't have an apple core, you could just slice the apples and then cut a circle out of the middle of each slice. But yeah, you just core it, slice off that extra little bit of skin, and now you want to do 1/4 inch slices. Obviously, the longer you leave apples out, the quicker they turn brown. So I did get delayed doing other things for a while, so you'll see a little bit later that they did turn a bit brown, but no big deal. They taste the same. Some people will use a little bit of lemon juice to keep them from turning brown, but I did not bother with that. And again, it does not change the taste, and sometimes if you do add lemon juice, it will affect the taste. Okay, so next step is to combine your sugar and your cinnamon. Now it's a fair amount of cinnamon, but it seems to work well. If you don't like the taste of too much cinnamon, you could back off on the amount. But the next step is to coat all our slices in the apple and cinnamon mixture. Now they do sell a cinnamon sugar in the stores too. You could try that instead of making your own. So just take the time to coat every individual slice. I kind of just started with a spatula, and then the ones that weren't coated later on, after shaking, I just kind of grab them by hand and turn them over, because the thing you want to make sure you don't do is to shake them too hard or handle them too hard where they break apart. You want that's why you don't cut them thin as well, so keep that in mind for when you're coating them, not to cut them too thin because they'll start breaking apart on you. Okay, so give them a shake, move a few around to get them all kind of equally coated if you can. It's not going to be perfect. Some people will not even do this step and don't apply anything to the slices and just do them plain, and then add your sugar and cinnamon later on. But I find this seems to work well. So you want to cover that up and let it sit while you're going to slowly heat up your oil and make your batter. And this is the setup by the sink here. I have my colander strainer and my fryer and everything set up. So we're going to add our dry ingredients to a large mixing bowl. And we're going to give that a stir. Get all the lumps out. Now there's kind of a fine balance between a batter that's too thick and too thin. This tends to be a little bit on the thinner side, so you could add a little bit more flour, but as long as they stick well to the slices. If you find they're too thin, then you can always add a little bit more flour, and the same if it's too thick, a little bit more milk or liquid. Okay, so here I'm just adding the liquid ingredients to the dry mixture, and I just start with a dough whisk just to kind of get it started. These Danish dough whisks are good for, especially when you're initially mixing wet and dry ingredients in a dough. But for batter, they only work at the very beginning, and then you got to switch to a regular wire whisk. So your main goal here is to get it nice and smooth. Make sure all the flour, there's no lumps. So it takes anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute to get the right consistency. And following this step, you're going to let this sit covered for roughly 10 to 15 minutes while your oil is heating up. You want to set your fryer to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 180 Celsius, around there, give or take 5 degrees. But you want to let the baking powder work the mixture to let it rise a little bit, but it's not like yeast, it doesn't need a lot of time to work. Some people don't let it sit for any time and they just start using it right away, but I find if you let it sit, it's a little bit, it adheres better to the apple slices and it puffs up a little bit better. So I just scrape the sides there with a spatula just to get everything into the center. This is quite a large bowl, but I cover it, and in the meantime my oil is heating up. And after it's heated up to the proper temperature, I'm not using a basket this time. I find there's not a lot of room and it's a fairly small basket. So there's your temperatures. And you're just frying them until they're golden brown, not too dark, not too light. You want to make sure that that batter is cooked. And we're generally not cooking the apple slice too much. It's going to remain, have a little bit of a crunch to it anyway. So your main goal is to just cook that batter, or fry that batter. Okay, so I do 3 slices at a time. I submerge them and I flip them around. And you try to get as much batter off as you can, but don't worry about it too much. If you get too much off, then you're exposing the apple to the oil, which is not a good thing either, because you'll get a lot of splattering because of the water content of the apple. So, and obviously if you're not using a basket, you have to have a proper scoop to scoop them out and drain some of the oil. You'll see the little bits of dough that kind of hung on to the apple slices. Does create a bit of a mess too. So Appelflappen is a little bit more, I would say, splattery and a little bit messier than doing other types of frying. So that's why I don't make them too often, but they are a very nice treat. Just takes a bit of time. Again, if you find your batter too thin, you could always add a touch more flour, give it a good whisk. And also the end result, sometimes these look fairly dark, that's just because the cinnamon adds a bit of darker tint to them. So if you weren't to add the cinnamon until the very end, you'll end up with a lighter fritter. So just keep that in mind. But we all like cinnamon, so that's why we add it to the slices before we dip them in the batter and fry them, but not everyone will do that. I think it adds a nice flavor with the sugar, obviously. So keep just working through your slices. Obviously be careful when you're putting them in that you're not dropping them in the oil and splattering. Sometimes they'll kind of layer on top of each other, so you have to kind of separate them. And there you can see I'm almost done. I have a few more to do. And again, they turned out a little bit darker because of the cinnamon. But that's generally what they look like. It's always nice to add a little bit of icing sugar on top. And some people like to dip them in icing sugar as well, so you can have a little separate bowl when they're served. But a nice holiday treat. And generally make them during the cold months, but not during the summer. I'll just cut one open for you. So they're fairly thin, not too heavy. So I hope everyone tries it. Thank you for watching. Please stay tuned for more videos. Please subscribe, and bye for now.